Hi, this is Meredith from Carborough, North Carolina, and you're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics.
Are you listening?
Welcome back to Two Broads Talking Politics. I am one of your hosts, Sophie, and as usual, I'm here with your other co-host, Kelly. Hi, Kelly.
Hello, everyone.
Tonight we are joined by Kat Calvin. She's the founder of Spread the Vote, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to obtaining government-issued photo IDs for eligible voters. Welcome, Kat.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So you founded Spread the Vote. Can you tell us a little bit sort of about the genesis of this organization and what sort of drove you to start doing this?
Sure. I'm like, half the rest of the world. I started it after the November election. I've been a social entrepreneur for a while. I'm a lawyer and had studied sort of voting rights in law school, but it was back when we still had a fully functioning Voting Rights Act. And so as I was sort of going off in sort of my life and career, I saw Shelby County v. Holder happen in the Supreme Court, and I saw voter ID laws being passed all across the country and, more and more restrictive gerrymandering and just all of the things that happened when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and there wasn't really a lot happening. There wasn't a lot of successful measures at countering it. There have been a lot of attempts to stop it in the courts and et cetera, but they've really proliferated across the country. And so after the election, I thought, well, all right, time to go back into the social entrepreneurship world and figure out what my part can be in trying to stop this train. And voter ID laws have always been something that I've been really interested in. And it just, it was really obvious to me that they had not only an impact on the presidential election, but really they have huge impacts on local elections, because when you're dealing with local elections, you're dealing with very small margins of victories. And so you don't have to suppress that many votes to really impact an election. And I'm a pretty practical person, and I like measurable impact. Like, I need to be able to look at a spreadsheet every night and know the impact that I made. And it just seemed really obvious that if you need an ID to vote, then why don't we just get people IDs? And there wasn't anyone else doing it, so I did.
So I got to tell you, the day after the 2016 election, I woke up and I thought, what can I do? I know what we need to do. We need to get everyone IDs. And I thought about it for a couple of weeks, and then I never did it.
Well, I'm so glad you had the thought.
Well, I am so impressed that you actually did it, because the thought does very little good if no one actually does it.
That's so funny.
So let's talk for a little bit about sort of the rationale that's used behind these kind of laws, that you need to have an ID to vote. So I live in Illinois, where you do not need to show ID when you vote, but you do need to show ID to register to vote. So, what's sort of the rationale behind these laws? And then what are some of the reasons that it's very difficult for people to get IDs? I think there's a lot of arguments out there like, well, everyone should have an ID. It shouldn't be that hard. But clearly it is very difficult for some people.
Right. And I always say you're right. Everyone should have an ID, and it shouldn't be that hard, but they don't, and it is. And so let's talk about that. You're totally right about that. So, the argument that's used for voter ID laws, and I'm glad that you mentioned the registration piece, because there are some states that don't technically qualify as voter ID laws, but they require ID in different parts of the process. So it's basically the same thing. Everyone, uses the excuse of voter fraud, which anybody who has read a newspaper or been on, certain corners of Twitter or whatever, knows, and it just doesn't happen. Like, in-person voter fraud, every reputable study on the planet has shown there's, it's like 0.00002%, right, of votes have been fraudulent. It just doesn't happen. There is a very small percentage of voter fraud that happens through absentee voting, which voter ID laws don't cover, because you don't need an ID to vote absentee. And if you think about it, that's just logical, right? Like, there are obviously going to be more people who try to cheat by mailing in a ballot than by walking into a polling station in a funny glasses and a hat and like trying to guess somebody's name on the rolls, right? Like, it's an absurd idea. And I always just die laughing when people say, oh, they're bringing massive buses of Mexicans up and they're all walking in and like, what, pretending to be John Smith? Like, it's not happening. And so it's, it's just, most of these things, you think about them logically for 5 seconds and you realize they're absurd. And there's no voter fraud. And we've proven that over and over again. And the people who pass the laws also frequently on camera say, oh, yeah, well, the reason we need voter ID laws is because they stop people from voting, which is what they do. And they stop particular people from voting. The people who are most affected by voter ID laws are the same people who are most affected by most adverse pieces of legislation. It's people who have low incomes, it's the elderly, it's people of color, the young people, right? It's all of the same people who are most at risk in this country. There are 21 million eligible voters, 11% of people in this country who don't have photo ID. And that's just eligible voters. So that doesn't include, for instance, the 1.4 million returning citizens in Florida who aren't technically eligible voters because until Amendment 4 passes in November, they actually can't vote, right? So one thing we have found is that there are so many people who aren't technically eligible to vote who don't have ID. So the 21 million number is just that eligible voter number. And, when you don't have ID, you can't get a job. You can't get housing. Like a lot of medical care you can't get. There are food banks that won't give you food. Actually, a lot of food banks that require ID. There are a lot of shelters that require ID before you can sleep there, right? Like if you think about everything you pull your ID for every day, it's a necessary thing. And that's in all 50 states. And it's really hard to get in all 50 states. And so even though 34 states require some form of identification to vote, and 20 of those require specific types of photo ID, the ID issue is really an issue in all 50 states. So to answer your question about how hard they are to get an ID, and we're talking government-issued photo ID, and the ID we generally get for people is what's called sort of the walker's ID that you get at the DMV. So it's a non-driver's license ID. You have to show a birth certificate, which 57% of the people we work with don't have, and for a variety of reasons. I mean, people move, people have, natural disasters, people are elderly and maybe never had a birth certificate in the first place. People may be homeless, right? There are a lot of reasons that you may not keep a birth certificate, which your parents got the day you were born, and then, God knows whatever happens to it. So a lot of people don't have birth certificates. You have to show proof of residency, which if you're homeless or if you're a student and don't have, a utility bill in your name or whatever, it can be really difficult. You have to show proof of Social Security. So we know the ins and outs of the Social Security Administration very well at this point. Proof of identity, there's all these different things you need. In a lot of states, like Georgia, you have to show proof every time your name changed. So if you're a woman who perhaps was married more than once, changed your name more than once, was widowed, whatever, you have to show every divorce decree, every death certificate, every marriage certificate, every single piece of paper to prove why and when you changed your name. So there's a lot of paperwork that's required. And then it's expensive. IDs are not free. They range, depending on the state, between usually about $25 to $34. Birth certificates are expensive, especially because if you go to Vital Records to get your birth certificate, you need an ID, but you need a birth certificate to get an ID. So we have to use this very sort of out-of-the-way, expensive process that has been set up as an alternative method for people to get birth certificates by proving their identity in a different way. But of course, they make it very expensive. And so, our average ID cost is $40, which is tough for a lot of people. I mean, I work for a nonprofit. $40 is a lot of money to me. And if you're homeless, if you're elderly on a fixed income, if you're a student whose parents maybe don't have the money, $40 is a lot to a lot of people. And then, of course, transportation. If you don't have an ID, you can't drive. And in most parts of the country, we don't have great public transportation. And we don't have great public transportation that's taking you to the DMV, right, or to Vital Records. And so transportation is really a challenge. And then a big piece that we, really work on is just advocacy, right? Like you're having to go to the Social Security Administration. You're having to figure out how do I get a birth certificate if I don't have one and I don't have an ID and vital records won't help me? You have to deal with the DMV and sit there for 4 hours, to get your ID, and just dealing with going to these government offices and really advocating for yourself, especially if you are someone who maybe hasn't had the best luck with the government, who doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with bureaucracy or all of these things. It's a real challenge. So there are a lot of different barriers that are put in the way of people being able to get an ID.
And so I'm wondering a little bit about how you are finding people to help, because I imagine that people who don't have IDs are also maybe not like spending a lot of time in get out the vote sections of the internet. Like, how are you finding people and like sort of approaching them and saying, hey, are you registered to vote? Do you need help?
Yeah, so you're right. And you guessed that right off the bat. I had to fail miserably for a while before I figured that out, because when I started Spread the Vote, I was like, oh, we'll just canvass with voter reg orgs and knock on people's doors and ask them if they have ID. And everybody thought we were ICE. And it was a horrible, horrible thing. And I will always feel guilty about that. And so we realized very quickly, oh, no, this is not the way to do it. And I had to learn just so much about this process, because I've had a passport since I was an infant and a military ID since I was 10 and a driver's license since I was 16, right? And most of us are like that. And so you don't think about what life is like without an ID, but also like how personal it is and how terrifying it is not to have an ID, especially now. But brown people have been being arrested for not having ID for 100 years. It is not something new, and not even illegal not to have an ID, but they'll arrest you anyways. And so we realized, okay, we can't just go up to people and say, do you have an ID? Because they will run from you. And, what we also realized, and sort of this part we sort of knew initially and we figured out how to pair it was, the way that we work is that we build local chapters and then train volunteers in those communities on how to help people in those communities. One of our core values is that we're all about locals helping locals, because it takes us an average of 3 to 4 weeks to get an ID. So it's a long process. It's something that is recommended. You have to do it in person. It requires a lot of touches with someone. And because we have yet to find a single community where there aren't people who love and care about their communities and want to help the people in it. And so we're very big on, training people to help people in their communities. And then what that means is we're able to partner with local organizations who work with the demographics of people who are more likely not to have IDs. So everything from homeless shelters to schools to jails, public housing units. We do work with voter reg orgs to try to, help them understand that they are registering people to vote who don't have ID. So, we need to be able to work with them, and really just everyone in town who is running an organization that is touching someone who doesn't have an ID. And then we work with them in a couple of ways. One thing that we do is we will just go, set up a table, say, once a week at St. Mary's shelter. And, our volunteers will be there every Tuesday from 4 to 8 or whatever. And you'll sit there and set up a table so that, as soon as we are in a space that is trusted by the community, people will line up at the door immediately. And that was actually the first thing that happened. I went to Georgia and just totally massively failed for 2.5 months and did everything wrong and scared a lot of people. And then I went to Virginia and I was like, all right, I've done everything wrong. I think maybe I understand how we can do this right. And one of the first things that we did was find a food bank and talk to them and say, hey, you have people who come here who need ID? And they were like, yeah, obviously, most of the people. And they were like, and so we said, can we come set up a table? And we had, to this point, had no luck with anybody trusting us. We went and we started to set up our table. And one of the staff members told the folks who were at the food bank, hey, they're here to help you get an ID. And we actually never got the table set up because the line was out the door immediately. And people were like, oh, I need help. And we were pulling out our phones and our iPads and just like taking down information. And it was like this light went off and we were like, oh, this is the difference, is that someone they trust is telling them that they can trust us, and they desperately need help with something, but they're only going to ask someone they trust. So we partner with local organizations who all, are serving people who they know need IDs in order to be able to rebuild their lives, in order to be able to sort of move up. but those organizations don't have the capacity to help them get IDs. And so it works out really well. Our partnerships work really well. We're able to build that trust, and we're able to serve the community in a way that our partners aren't able. So it works really well.
So you mentioned Georgia and Virginia. Where all are you located right now?
We are in Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida, and we'll be launching in more states next year.
And how did you sort of come up? Are those just